So the theme of the retreat this weekend is a broad theme. It was actually suggested because this is the time when we're celebrating several different birth anniversaries. Buddha today, right? Buddha Purnima. Yeah. And just very recently we had the birth anniversary of Shankaracharya and Ramanujacharya, two of the great philosophical figures and spiritual figures of India, of course. Generally, we think of the three schools of Vedanta, although there are many others. But the main three schools, the Shankaracharya and Ramanuja, will be the chief figures of the first two, and then Madhva. The other, but we have others, Vallabhacharya, Nimbarka, and there are many schools. But very generally, we can say these fall into under the three categories, or Advaita Vedanta, Vishishta Advaita Vedanta, and Dvaita Vedanta. So, Buddha himself represents the counterbalance to this tendency to try to rationally understand everything. And in many ways his life was a reaction to not only the ritual, which was very prevalent at that time, and priestcraft and the power in the hands of the Brahmins, many of the things we know about, but also there's a tendency to try to rationally understand everything. And one thing we'll find is that when we get to the lives of what I would say are the great saints, we see a little distinction between the philosophers and the saints. When we get to the lives of the saints, very rarely do we find them writing philosophical texts or anything like that. Now, in defense of our acharyas, they also had two sides to them. On the one hand, they were almost forced, in order to establish their position, to engage in this philosophical reasoning. This is all Vada. And they had to argue against other positions. So they're forced into the position of trying to prove other people wrong. This is how one establishes one's own philosophical position, to show that there are flaws in the other positions. That's in addition to showing the logic of one's own stance, we have to show that there are fallacies in the others. But on the other hand, there's something called Upadesha, these instructions. And these are equally important, if not more important. And we'll find when we get to, say, Shankaracharya, when we get to something like Bhaja Govindam. We read his Bhaja Govindam hymn, and we'll read something like Dhammapada of the Buddha. We'll see absolutely no difference at all. That when it comes to these higher teachings, that philosophy becomes less and less important, and things like detachment and devotion and renunciation, dedication, sincerity, all of these things become the most important elements in spiritual life. So we'll find that, especially with Shankaracharya and Buddha, that there are counterbalances. In many senses they're almost opposites, and then in another sense they're in perfect agreement from this point of view of spiritual practice and spiritual life. And Swamiji himself held these two up as the ideal examples of what he would say head and heart. So he always wanted to see that combination. There's a very nice quote from Swamiji. What is now wanted is the combination of the greatest heart with the highest intellectuality, of infinite love and infinite knowledge. Existence without knowledge and love cannot be. Knowledge without love and love without knowledge cannot be. What we want is the harmony of existence, knowledge, and bliss infinite. For that is our goal. We want harmony, not one-sided development. And it is possible to have the intellect of a Shankara with the heart of a Buddha. I hope we shall all struggle to attain that blessed combination. And Swamiji was really talking about himself, without meaning to talk about himself. He wasn't thinking about himself, but he's the perfect example of the intellect of a Shankaracharya and the heart of a Buddha. And for Swamiji, if he had to choose between the two, he used to say the heart is more important. If there's ever a conflict between the head and the heart is more important. And for that reason, he had a little bit of special devotion for Buddha, and he had a little bit of quarrel with Shankaracharya. He could never quite forgive Shankaracharya for some of his orthodox beliefs, especially this idea of adhikara vada, that only certain people are qualified to have access to Vedas and Upanishads. So he didn't like the exclusiveness. Of course, Shankaracharya wasn't responsible for that. This was a very ancient tradition, but he upheld it. And Buddha was the opposite. Now, we can say partly because Buddha was an outsider. He was from the Kshatriya, right? He wasn't for the Brahmin. It wasn't his community. So, and Swamiji also was. So Swamiji identified, we can say, with the Buddha more, although he said that he loved the philosophy of Shankaracharya. He loved the compassion of Buddha, but he also, we know, he loved this Advaita Vedanta philosophy. And he combined both in the sense that he wanted to make this Advaita available to everyone, not just regardless of caste in India, but regardless of East or West. So when he spoke in the United States, he didn't hesitate to give the very highest Advaita Vedanta teachings that way. So somehow I want to try to talk about the life of Buddha, but do it where it brings in a little bit of this counterbalance to Shankaracharya, and then we'll get to Ramanuja also, which will also show the degree to which the teachings of the Upanishads can be interpreted in different ways, and not just teachings of the Upanishads. The whole concept of truth takes on not exactly a relative coloring to it, but it allows for different approaches and different ways of interpreting it. That the philosophers give the impression on one hand that we can come out with a formula that will explain the nature of reality, the relationship between, of course, the three main elements, Brahman, the Jiva and Jala, these three things. But the teachings that we get by what I will say are these great saints is that there is no objective philosophical truth. That Brahman alone is the truth. That experience is what's true. And even Shankaracharya, even he'll say Anubhuti is the ultimate truth. That there's a direct experience that way. But when we get to Sri Ramakrishna, and we'll see Swamiji also, we can't pin them down to any particular philosophical position. Many people try. Was Sri Ramakrishna, was he a dualist? Was he a non-dualist? Was he in between? It's silly almost to think in those terms, because he had a different worldview that way. Everything was direct experience, and everything else is a vain attempt to try to describe that experience or to describe the reality that can allow for such an experience. So, on the one hand, we have a great deal of philosophical speculation that will establish one particular point of view, which we can say is a particular model that way, and which is helpful. and allows for a particular spiritual attitude. So there's great value to all of these things. It's not that they're arbitrary or anything, but they're not absolute, that's all. There are different ways of describing things and explaining things. This idea of models is very helpful because in science, we'll find that for a particular experiment or a particular problem or something, one model will work better than another. Right? It's not that that's the only one that's true, the only one that can be useful, but it'll be more helpful. Not that there's anything absolute about it. So Sri Ramakrishna's view really was something like that. We'll get to that more in tonight's talk. So anyhow, let us start with a little bit of this life of Buddha, since today is his birthday. We know and we hear these stories told over and over again. I think probably everyone knows all of the stories of the Buddha's life, but they're helpful. It's nice to hear these things. Many Western traditions, church, synagogue, and everything, they'll repeat these things. Every year you'll hear the very same stories, and everyone will relive them and think about them. So there's a great value to all of that. Anyhow, Buddha was born on the full moon day of Vaishak in 563 BC, although now we're thinking maybe it's wrong. This is a traditional date that's given. I think Chinese calendar may be a little different, something like that. But he was the son of a king, but we shouldn't think it was a big king. There were lots of small little kingdoms, so it was probably something relatively modest that way. And now it's probably in Nepal, near the Bihar border, just in that area. And he was given the name Siddhartha, a very nice name, or Gautama, but Siddhartha, one who has achieved the goal. Artha is Siddha. So the goal has been achieved, so it was very prescient type of name. It would prove to be true, of course. And when they cast his horoscope, it was foretold that he would either become a very great warrior and a great king and great leader, or he would be a wandering holy man and give up everything and become a great spiritual soul that way. Now, his parents, being like typical parents, of course, didn't want to see him become a wandering monk. Even today, so many of our sadhus who join, their parents are furious. It's like the worst possible thing. Oh my God, the son will become a sannyasi. Terribly. And some even have lawsuits, that against the order. Yeah, we have cases like that, recent cases even. Yeah, they'll say, "Oh, my son's been brainwashed," and they'll do anything. I know a very recent case that I just heard of. The parents told the son his father was dying, and then when he came back to see his father, they more or less locked him up in his room, so he couldn't join. So partly because the son lives in the house of the parents and looks after them. In the West, they'll lose the son anyhow. Who goes someplace else. So anyhow, and they knew that someone will have to take over the kingdom, and they wanted him to be raised to be the future king that way. So they were warned that if he sees anything that will awaken his feeling of renunciation, that at any time he may go. So there was an edict in the kingdom that he should never see anything that would make him aware of the suffering of the world, or see anything that would lead him to this feeling of renunciation. So he shouldn't see any suffering, he shouldn't see any old age, he shouldn't see any death or disease, anything like that. So this was the royal edict. So he led a very isolated type of life. He rarely went outside of the compound of the palace, and they made sure that there was constant singing and dancing and eating and dining and all of that kind of stuff, and he was never allowed to see anything. But he was friendly with the charioteer. So he cut a deal with them. He says, every once in a while you'll take me out, take me for a round, and let me see what's going on out in the outside of the kingdom, outside of the palace walls. So he had 4 trips and 4 different visions. The first day, they go out and he sees a very old man. He's bent over with a cane and everything, and can't stand up. It looks like he's about to fall. And he was so naive that he had no idea what this was all about. He was never allowed to see even older people. His parents were still young at that time. So he asked this charioteer, who was this old man, with his teeth have fallen out, his hair has turned white, he's all skin and bones, he can barely walk. So the charioteer said to him, "Sire, this is an old man. He is weak, he's helpless, he's been abandoned by his family. It says, abandoned by his family as birds leave a withered tree." So then Buddha says to him, "How did this happen? I've never seen anything like this." He said, "How does it happen? It happens to everyone." He said, "Everyone. Even my parents, it'll happen, yes. Even me, it'll happen, yes." So he became very upset that he had never thought that anything like this could happen. So he went back, and then after some time, he asked his charioteer to take him out again. And he saw a very sick man, groaning in pain, lying at the side of the road. And he said, "Who is he? What happened to this man?" And he said, "Sire, he is a sick man. There's no hope for him. He'll die soon." And then he said, "How does it happen?" He said, "It happens. Will it happen to everyone? It'll happen to everyone. Will it happen to me? It'll happen to you." And he said, "None can escape. Sooner or later, everyone will fall prey to some type of sickness." So again, he's very upset, and he goes back to his palace, and then a week or so later, he goes out and he sees a long line of people walking down the road, and then he sees 4 of them carrying someone that looks like lying on a cot and covered with a white cloth. And he said, "What is this? What happened?" And they said, "This is a dead man." And he said, "Dead man? Where are they going?" "They're going to the funeral pyre. They'll burn his body, and it'll be nothing but ashes." And he said, "Well, how does this happen?" He said, "It'll happen to everyone." So the same question to my mother, to my father, to me, all of that. So yes. So he said, "Sire, there's no escape from this. Everyone will die sooner or later." So now think, for us, we see these things and nothing special happens. We know these things. And we don't think about, this is the vanity of life, and this is the shortness of life and everything. But he was like, Thakur used to say, some people are like very dry kindling. Yes, as soon as they come close to a match, they light up. The rest of us are wet firewood. You keep putting fire under it, and the water keeps coming and blowing it out. So he said, so this is what we mean by life. Youth gives way to old age, health to disease, and life to death. And people find pleasure in such a world. So his mind is very disturbed. And he goes back. Then the 4th time he goes out. And after, thinking about only the suffering and misery of the world, he goes out and he sees a very handsome young man dressed in Garwa, and his face beaming, not looking this way or that, full of joy. And he says, "Who is this man wearing these beautiful robes, looking so peaceful, so calm, so fearless, so joyful?" And then the charioteer says, "He is a wandering mendicant with no possessions, no desires, no cares." And then Buddha, he must have been 16, 18, something like that, a young man. He says, "Good. He is a happy man and he is a wise man. I would like to be such a man." So then he hatched the plan, of course, that he returned to the palace and thought, I'll have to do all of this. Now he had just recently been married to a very beautiful young woman, and had given birth to a child. In fact, the child was born after that. So he went back, and of course his mind is filled with this idea of renunciation, and also the great joy of nirvana, that idea. And he gets news that the child has been born. So he said, Rahu jato bandhanam jatam, that a Rahu was born. So they named him Rahula. A fetter has arisen, and this will be my bondage, he said. So they named him Rahula, meaning fetter, impediment, and even though, imagine, he has a young wife, and the child is just born, and that his wife, Yashodhara, he feels this tremendous bondage because of the child and the wife and everything, and his renunciation was so strong that even that he left behind. Now think also, the condition that Swamiji was in, not attachment to his wife, but his mother and his brothers, who were starving at the time. And he also had to make that decision to renounce everything. So the tremendous detachment and renunciation, the fire of renunciation had to be so strong. So because of the child, there was a big festival, there was a big feast, and they were singing and dancing and drinking, and everyone is to him it looked like demons rolling on the floor, drunk and everything, and it was unbearable to him. So it was like a living hell. And he went to the bedroom, the wife was sleeping there with the baby, and looked down silently and said goodbye, and then left. And he went to the stable and he got a horse, and he went out and he found a beggar, exchanged his clothes, he took his sword and cut off his hair that way, and that began the life of a wandering mendicant. Now, what was he going in search of? This, at that time, of course, there was no such thing as Buddhism. There was no idea of this nirvana. This probably is a term that it was coined by the Buddhists themselves. But still, there was always an ancient tradition of sannyasa. We know that at that time, and there were different communities. So he would have been with some of the very typical communities. Some of them were extremely austere. And it said that he ate the food equivalent to one sesame seed each day. Of course, they exaggerated a little. And became so thin that you could see his backbone from the front. And if you see some of the images from the Indian side, the Buddha, he'll be thin as a rail. And then you see China and Japan, he'll be big and fat. So by the time he got to China, he gained a lot of weight. Something happened there. So anyhow, he was with some of these communities that were very austere, and then we know the story. One night, he practically fainted and everything, and there was a young woman named Sujata, and she gave him a little bowl of pudding, payas, so that his spirits were revived a little. All the other sadhus who were there, they all gave him up. They said, "Oh, he's a fallen monk now. He's given away to luxury. He ate some rice pudding that way." So they gave him up. Then that night he took that vow. There's a very beautiful verse. This is a very important verse because Swamiji liked this verse so much that they had it written on the wall of the Baranagar Mutt. This ihasane shushyadume shariram tavasti mansam pralayam chayatu aprapya bodhim bahukalpa dolabham naivasanat kaimadas chalishete. So it says, let me sit on this seat until either I have realization or that let this body wither away. Let it become bones and go to ashes and all of that. It doesn't matter how many lifetime years it takes. I won't get up from the seat until I have this realization. So then we know the whole night he went through all of these struggles, that all of the temptations came to him. We can say that this Maya was tempting him, or it was his own mind, whatever it was, but by the time morning came, he'd achieved his enlightenment, and he became Buddha, the awakened one. So This was all took place in one night. Of course, after many years of hard struggle and meditation and everything, and but then he understood that extreme austerity was not the way, and of course luxury was not the way. So this is a madhyapanta, this middle path. So he established that as something very important. Then really spent the rest of his life preaching and organizing. So this was also similar to Shankaracharya. He also founded the first organized monastic tradition in India. Before that, taking sannyasa meant just as an individual. There were maybe communities and things, but not big monasteries where all the monks would live together. It became so popular that the vast majority of India became Buddhist at one time. And Swamiji felt that this was one of the problems, that the most qualified members of society did not go into the householder direction. So the society suffered a little bit on account of that. But he started a movement that was so tremendous. And my personal feeling is that Buddha himself was the one responsible for the end of the Vedic period and the beginning of the modern Hindu period. Because at that time, one of the things that he railed against was the ritualistic nature of religion, all of the yajnas that were performed, and the power of the priests, and the exclusive nature of everything. So he was very egalitarian, very democratic, that he thought the spiritual truth should be open to everyone. So there was no caste distinction or anything. At that time, any important spiritual writings or teachings had to be in Sanskrit. So he didn't do it. Of course, he probably, who knows if he knew Sanskrit even. He was being trained up to be a king and a warrior that way. So everything was in Pali. Pali was the language of the day. And everything was very, very practical and anti-metaphysical, we can say. Because whenever he was asked these questions about the nature of the self, is there a self? Is there a creator? Is this universe eternal? And any of these metaphysical questions, mostly he would remain silent, or he would try to explain that these are not very important in spiritual life, that way. And one of his favorite illustrations was that of the person who was shot by the arrow. That a man in a certain village was shot with a poison-tipped arrow and was about to die, and they brought the physician who was about to pull the arrow out and try to clean the wound and save him and everything. And he said, before you pull it out, I want to know who shot me. So they said, okay, and I want to know what village he was from, and I want to know what his caste was, and I want to know who his ancestors were. All this. So then the Buddha says, tell me what will happen before they get the answers to all of these questions. So there's the bhikkhus, these other monks say, well, surely he'll die before. And he said, yes. So if we want to know how this universe came into existence, if we want to know, is it eternal, is it non-eternal, if we want to know, are there many individual souls, or is there only one Atman that we also... All of these big questions, if we want to know them first, before we try to pull the arrow out. Because his point was that we're suffering now. Yes, of course, we'll see one of the most important ideas, that we're suffering. Then we'll never do it. We'll die first. So he really emphasized the fact that these are very secondary questions, all of the philosophical things, especially if it prevents us from doing our spiritual practice. If we do it side by side, it's not so bad. In the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, we find Thakur telling M many, many times, not just once, many times. He'll say, don't reason anymore. Vichara korona is vichara. He'll say, promise me that you won't do it. Because M had that tendency a little bit. Now, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't reason things out and think about things, but only to the point where we can develop some understanding and some conviction. Then we don't keep going back and reinventing the wheel. Once we've done it once, then we have to go ahead with our spiritual practice. So we do need to understand some spiritual principles enough to give us some conviction. But the real conviction that we have to have is that realization is possible. This is the most important thing. And this is why we need holy company. Those who saw Sri Ramakrishna, they couldn't doubt that this transformation is possible and that this transformation brings tremendous joy and peace. And this is the type of conviction that we really need. We don't need to have this conviction that, oh, this Advaita Vedanta, everything about it is true, or that qualified Advaita non-dualism has the real answer. This type of conviction is not necessary. But if by studying these things it gives us a blueprint, a way of understanding, and helps us in our spiritual practice, we know what our meditation is, why we're doing meditation. If we don't have any concept of these things, then of course we won't be able to develop the conviction that this can lead to something higher. We have to know a little bit about this relationship between cause and effect. In fact, with meditation, one of the most important elements of meditation is understanding what happens in meditation and why we're meditating and who it is who's meditating. Right? Because the goal of meditation is to realize the real nature of the self, who it is who's doing that meditation. So there's a role for these things, but Buddha was on the side emphasizing the secondary nature of all of this. And really these questions, he understood that there was a tendency to get it wrong. So he would say, people would ask him, we're asking you, is there a self? Is there a permanent self? And you remain silent. And he said, yes, because if I say yes, there'll be a false understanding that this individual I is real, this ego and everything. And if I say no, then they'll think, well, nothing exists. So either they'll be like the materialists on one hand, or they'll be like the nihilists on the other hand. So whatever I say will be understood wrongly by those who don't have a deeper understanding of all of this. So this was the rationale that he gave for all of these things. So his teachings were very, very simple. That there's tremendous suffering in this world, and that there's a way to get out of it, and he can teach the way to get out of it, and we can have that ultimate realization. And when we have that realization, then whatever it was that we needed to get to, dharma, then we don't need it anymore. So he gave a very nice illustration. He said, suppose you go to a river, you want to cross to the other side, and you see a boat is there. And you take the boat, and you get in, and you cross to the other side of the river. What will you do with the boat? Yeah, will you carry it on your shoulders with you? And then he says that dharma is for crossing, not for keeping. So this is what Sri Ramakrishna meant when he said that once we pass the stage of Vaidhi Bhakti, then we can give up all of these things. Everything becomes free and spontaneous. So he said, yes, you can leave the boat, or you can push it back to the other shore, let someone else cross. Again, Sri Ramakrishna said, when you dig a well, what need do you have for the shovel? You can throw it into the well at that point, or save it for someone else to dig another well. So this was his idea about even the little bit of philosophy that we need to help us get to the other side. After that, or ritual or practice or anything, after that we don't need it anymore. So his real teachings, we can say, will go back to what's called the Four Noble Truths. The first, suffering exists. Now, this, of course, is something that's found in the Vedantic teachings as well, but not emphasized to the same extent. We have this dukkhalayam, this in Gita, this world is the abode of suffering. But in general, we have more emphasis on, well, there's joy and sorrow, and both are there. Swamiji used to like to say that, always an equal amount. But for Buddha, he emphasized this idea of suffering. Everything is painful. Birth is painful, death is painful, separation is painful, all of these things. So he emphasized this idea that all of the things that he saw, that we can't, no one is free from old age and disease and suffering, pain, and then the mental suffering, which is worse. There's depression, despair, anxiety, fear. All of these are very painful things. So we know these things, not that every second is painful, but there's no way we can avoid occasionally having some type of difficulties and problems in life. And the sad thing is that people whose lives are smoothest suffer the most at the end. So if you have a bad marriage and the husband or wife dies, it's not so terrible. We have a very good marriage, we see this sometime, and then the remaining partner suffers tremendously at the end, missing the other one. Yeah, so it's very, as Swamiji said, the plan of the universe is devilish.
Yeah,
remember
yeah.
He said that to Hirananda in Kashipur, they had the discussion. Yeah. So, this element of suffering will be there, and this is the most important thing for him. Now, Swamiji, of course, emphasizes this idea, equal amount, that there'll always be an equal amount of suffering and misery in the world, that we fix things in one place, something goes bad in another place, and we see that the more we take care of creature comforts. Now we don't suffer from heat and cold, we have our air conditioner here with so many conveniences that we have now, but we have to work so much longer for them. And the anxiety is so much greater. So whatever physical difficulties have lessened, the tension and anxiety and everything, that's increased. So Swamiji says there's always an equal balance, but in another place he says, well, if you really want to know, probably there's more misery. So in that way, he kind of agrees with Buddha. This idea of death being a great source of suffering, not just our own death and death of other people, is explained in a very beautiful story that has to do with Buddha. There was someone named Kisha Gautami. She was a cousin of the Buddha, and in those days cousins married each other. And Yashodhara, I think, was also a cousin. Anyhow, she sang a very beautiful song at one time, and Buddha happened to hear it, and he wanted to give her something, so he gave her some necklace or something like that. And then she thought, oh, he loves me, that he'll marry me that way. But of course, marriage was arranged with the other one, and very quickly she became very despondent and in need and everything, and died at a very young age. Then they say that she was reborn and became this other, I think kept the same name, but anyhow, she was born into a very poor family and was married at a young age, and when she had to live in her husband's family, no one treated her very well, so her life was rather miserable. And then a son was born to her, and she loved the son, very proud of the son, and she gave her some type of self-respect, someone that she could love, that would love her back, so her life was very wonderful. This was the only thing that she had in her life, really, otherwise life was miserable. And the son died became ill and very quickly died, and she couldn't believe it. It was just too much, because it wasn't just losing the son, it was her whole life, really. So she became mad. She was so despondent, and she went from person to person and said, how can my son be revived? Can you give me some medicine or something to bring him back to life? So they laughed at her, and you mad woman, no one can bring a dead person back to life, this and that. And one person took a little pity and said, why not go to Buddha and ask him about that? So she went to him and said, is there some medicine that you can give my child to bring him back to life? So Buddha said, yes, I'm glad you've come to me. That what you need to do is go to a home and get a handful of mustard seed and bring that back to me, and then I'll make some medicine, we'll give to your son and he'll revive. So he said, very good. And then he said, but it has to be from a house where no one has ever died. So now think what a psychological genius he was. So she'll go to the first house and she'll say, can I have some mustard seed? And they'll say, of course. And then she'll say, oh, has anyone ever died here? Now in those days, of course, people didn't build new houses. These were ancestral properties handed down. So in each and every place, can you imagine that it'll bring back the memory, and one person will say, my brother died just 2 years ago, he was so wonderful, this and that, and she'll start weeping. In the next place, yes, I also had a child who died. So one by one she went until finally she realized that this is the law. No one lives forever, people die. It's not just me, it's not such a rarity that these things happen. So she went back to Buddha and he said, have you brought me the mustard seed? And he said, no, don't fool me with mustard seed anymore. Now I understand what you've done. Let me take refuge with you. So this is a story to show that this suffering and misery, these things aren't aberrations. It's part of the fabric of life. I remember a very interesting thing that happened to me. I had an eye injury many years ago, where somebody threw a jacket and it went into my eye, and I became blind in one eye. So we went to the eye doctor to see what could be done. We went to several different ones. And I was in Philadelphia once, my mother was there. And my mother said to this eye doctor, it was a very freak accident. And the doctor, he wasn't very nice about it, but he looked at my mother and said, they're all freak accidents. He's an eye doctor, so that's what he sees. It has to be something unusual, right? So they're all freak. I always remember that. So yeah, we think things are very rare and only will happen to us, but these things happen to everyone. And even that is a helpful. Swami Swanji, he used to say that we wake up one morning and we have fever and we're coughing and blood running nose and we feel miserable. And then we read in the paper that, the Asiatic flu has come and thousands of people are suffering from it. Immediately we feel better. We know we're not the only ones who are suffering. So that was what Buddha did, and she understood that this is common to everyone. But the second truth is that suffering has an origin. Now the origin of suffering, of course, this is a secondary cause, the death and disease and all of these things, but it's not simply contact with unpleasant things, but Buddha says that trishna, or tanha in Pali, is thirst, this desire for things that we don't have, this thirst for pleasure, the attachment to things that are pleasant, the aversion for things that are unpleasant, the fear of losing things that we have, the desire to get things we don't have. So he traces everything back to this feeling of some type of lack, that if only we had something that we don't have, we'll be happy. And it's a fool's errand. Because when we get the things that we think will make us happy, we find that no, that wasn't really it. Or if it makes us happy for a while, then we're so afraid that we'll lose it or it'll be damaged. Right? Think of the experience of getting a new car. Right? You can't imagine that the first dent that you get in it, how miserable you feel and everything. And then after 5-10 years, you don't bother to wash it even. It doesn't matter. Yeah. So it's all within the mind, this idea. So this and it all goes back to the ego, to this false type of identification that we have, and clinging to this idea of I, and suffering so much when we're not given proper respect and all of that. There's another nice Buddhist story. Someone went to the Buddha and starts insulting him, starts saying all sorts of nasty things to him, and Buddha is simply watching, no reaction, nothing at all. Then after the man is finished, he says to him, "Let me ask you a question." He says, "All right." He says, "Suppose someone wants to give you a gift, and you don't accept that gift. What will happen to that gift?" He said, "It will remain with the person who wanted to give it." He said, "In the same way, I'm not accepting your insults. They have to remain with you." So, yeah, so from this, we understand that no one can insult us if we don't get insulted. Right? Did you ever think of that? You may try to insult me. You may say nasty things about me, all of that, but unless I get insulted, it's not an insult. Right? You may say, "Oh, you look horrible today, that you spoke nonsense today," all of these things. And I may simply say, "Yes, you're right, I know, it wasn't very good today." So where is the insult? There's no insult. If I get offended, then it's an insult. So all of this, the source of suffering goes back to this ego sense, and this needy ego, which always has its desires and its wants. Some of the desires are for respect. This is also a great source of our suffering. Then we have the third of the Four Noble Truths, and that is that suffering has an end. Okay, so this is very important, that this is the ultimate goal. So there's something positive here, and this is what they call nirvana. And the distinctive feature of nirvana is that we don't have anything very positive to say about it. It's very interesting that from a Hindu perspective, there's a very common name is Anirvana, right? And the Buddhist perspective, it'll be nirvana. One means blowing out the flame, and the other means it can't be blown out. So one gives that idea of the eternal nature of the self, the other this transitory nature of the self. That blowing out that flame means the end of this round of birth and death. So this is at least one school of Buddhist thought, that there really is no permanent self, and this karmic wheel that makes us come back again and again and again doesn't require any permanent self. It's like a bucket of karma. You know, in a fire brigade, you take a bucket of water and you pass it to the next person, next person, next person, next person. There doesn't have to be one single person carrying it. The identification is all in that bucket of water. That's the only common factor. So the Vedantic idea will be more that there's some continuity. There is a thread that goes through each and every moment, which will be this sutratma, this self like that. Buddhist idea is everything is momentary. And when it comes to an end, it comes to an end. So this is that nirvana, that the flame is blown out that way. But nirvana can be experienced in this lifetime while living. So they have this jivan mukti idea. They do have that one attains nirvana in this very lifetime, and it's a state of perfect bliss and perfect joy. That nirvana. So this is the ultimate goal of life. So he says that just as the ocean has the taste of salt everywhere, so does nirvana have the taste of bliss everywhere. Then the fourth noble truth actually is a complicated one, because it lays out the path that we have to follow in order to attain nirvana. And this will be the Eightfold Path, and a lot of this is ethical and moral. It's very similar really to our Ashtanga Yoga that we have. So you'll have your ethical and moral preliminary teachings and everything, and then you'll have your meditation practices. And everything has to be samyak. Each one is a samyak. Everything has to be done perfectly, properly, in the right way. Now, the historical influence of the life of Buddha on the whole Indian tradition is tremendous, really tremendous. I was saying before that I really feel that it was because of him that the whole Vedic tradition got transformed into what we call a modern Hindu tradition. If you think about it, all of the Vedic gods and goddesses virtually disappeared or got transformed. Rudra and Shiva, somehow like that. And all of the Vedic yajna got replaced by puja. We have some remnants. We still have our homa, fire. We have a few things that carried over, but in general, that got transformed. The impersonal nature of the ultimate reality, Brahman, got transformed into personal God. Now, how this happened because of Buddha, not exactly clear, except that Swamiji likes to say that because Buddha didn't preach any personal God, that he himself took the place, symbolically at least, of the personal God, and that tremendous love and devotion that is normally directed towards the personal God was directed toward him. And he became the central figure. Of course, they won't say that they worship, they venerate the Buddha.
Yeah.
Yeah, a very subtle type of distinction. So we see this tremendous change that took place. And it's very interesting that the birth of Christ in the Jewish tradition had exactly the same effect. That Judaism before Christ was a priestly religion. And they had these fire sacrifices and burnt offerings. And see, Buddha was very much against animal sacrifice also. They had all of those things. And then afterwards it changed into rabbinical Judaism, where there was no more sacrifice done and everything was a type of worship. So we find the same thing. So his influence was tremendous. He revived the whole institution of sannyasa, really. That way, before it was kind of a haphazard thing. And then, of course, it more or less disappeared. This is one of the great mysteries, how such a vibrant, strong religious tradition could virtually vanish in the country of its origin. The growth, of course, was due to a large extent when King Ashoka converted to Buddhism. Before that, he was very antagonistic. Something happened, and he got converted to that, and it became really the dominant religious tradition. A little bit of degeneration took place, some tantric practices and other things, and maybe too much emphasis on monastic life, and then Buddha himself warned a little bit about having monks and nuns together. So certain things happened, and then of course we have this influx of this strong reaction on the side of not just Shankaracharya, we were talking about that earlier today, but the Mimamsakas, the followers of Sankhya, the dualistic philosophers. At that